Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining this event. And welcome to the Julia and Wrigley Global Futures Laboratory conversation series with today's topic, Global Disorder, the future of governance and geopolitics. Before we get to our session, there are a few announcements. First, after today's conversation, here we have a food truck called Hummus Express in the atrium. There are also vouchers for students. So where is Michelle? See Michelle, she's in the back waving here in the purple shirt. You can get your voucher from Michelle. Also, on April 21st, so Earth Day is, foreshadowing us here. On April 21, we have an event here between 9 and 12 in the atrium celebrating Earth Day. And we will discuss different topics, including Arizona water issues, energy decision-making, and we will hear from youth leaders to promote more equitable and just futures. During that event, we also will have food trucks, and you can find more details and also register for that event on our website, or I'm told you can scan the code on the screens above. So that's in the round. I'm not quite sure how that works, but I'm sure you are more technically capable than I am with these kind of things. So let's just set the context. We are actually increasingly talking about negative effects that are resulting from the pressure we are putting on our planet's life supporting system. Just on March 20, 3 weeks ago now, we heard from the 6th assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that the situation there is getting worse as we are moving forward. And just to name two things that most of you know, but some of you might not, we have failed to hold global warming at 1.5 degrees Celsius. We also, and that's less known, we typically say if we cannot mitigate, we just adapt. We also are reaching now the limits of parts of the Earth system to adapt. So it's not as easy as saying if we cannot mitigate, we simply adapt. So there are these signs, and this was just one example because it was recently released. And of course, we are seeing that there is pressure because we see more extreme events. They are closer by, different types, higher amplitudes, floods, wildfires, droughts, crop failures, etc. Now, at the same time as we are struggling with the environment in a way that I think humankind has not faced in modern history in this particular shape, we are also witnessing instabilities in our societal systems. And we know from history that such instabilities can spread from local to global on very short timescales. And that, of course, then raises the question of whether the trends and disruptions we are seeing in today's world, and the social systems in today's world, have the potential to lead to major threats for society at a time when we are also struggling with massive environmental threats. So, of course, there are measures that have been implemented. For example, multilateral institutions such as the United Nations, World Trade Organization, European Unions, also international alliances such as NATO, and they formed the base of the post-war global order. Now, currently, not that they never faced challenges, but currently they face unprecedented challenges. And if we are just looking at two of them, there is Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which threatens security in Europe and beyond. But at the same time, more widespread, actually, we see that nationalism undermines the support for globalization in many countries. And there you can go around the globe and you will see the seeds, or actually sometimes more than the seeds already. So the prospect of an emergent post-liberal international order raises many serious questions in that context. So today, with our distinguished panelists, we will discuss those questions and related ones that come out of the conversation and explore how geopolitical change shapes global futures. During that conversation, we will examine themes of security and conflict and the effects for global businesses, trade, science, and technology. So this discussion is envisioned as part of an ongoing effort. Mickey Kittleson, the Vice Dean of the College of Global Futures, who helped organize this event, will tell you a little bit more about how that is envisioned. So I will hand over to Mickey for this information on how this series is meant to unfold.
Great, thank you. I'm Mickey Kittleson, Vice Dean in the College of Global Futures, and Henry Thompson. I was looking for Henry, and Craig and I are interested in bringing together a network of scholars, graduate students, faculty, students from across the university around these themes of governance and the way geopolitical dynamics shape our global futures. And so we see today as an inaugural event in kicking this off, bringing us together and sustained collaboration and sustained conversation. And next year, we hope to have a series of workshops, or at least one workshop that we might co-create as a network. So if you're interested, please reach out to either Craig or Henry or me and let us know. We'll get you on our list, and we look forward to collaborating. Thank you.
Thank you, Mickey. A brief introduction of our panelists. I will not read their full CVs. That would take probably the entire session because they all have quite a bit to offer. But I'm sure if you want to see more, it's easy to find them on the website. So starting with Greg Calhoun is a comparative and historical sociologist and social theorist. He is the University Professor of Social Sciences at ASU, where he holds joint appointment in 6 schools, among other things. And I just name a few of them. All 6 would challenge me now to remember all of them, but it includes the schools of politics and global studies, future of innovation in society, sustainability, and the Thunderbird School of Global Management. Next to him, we have Sophal. He's the Associate Dean for Undergraduate Programs and Global Development, as well as Associate Professor in the Thunderbird School of Global Management. He teaches classes on the global political economy, international organizations, and regional management in Asia. Next to Sophal, we have Kathleen Vogel. Kathleen is a professor in the School for the Future of Innovation in Society, a senior global future scientist, and Malikian Center affiliate. She researches socio-technical assessments of biosecurity threats and knowledge production in weapons assessment in US intelligence. And next to me, we have Doug Guthrie. He's the Executive Director of Thunderbird China and a professor in the Thunderbird School of Global Management. Doug is an expert in international business and trade, technology and society, entrepreneurship and technology transfer, and organizational development. So let's start with a round of questions, and this is meant to be a conversation. So if any of the panelists wants to add to one of the questions directed to any of you, just feel free to come in. So if we are looking at today's world, how does today's global situation compare to that of the Cold War? That's of course something that comes to mind. And what related to that was the most unsettling, what is most unsettling the global political economy today? And maybe we can start that with you, Doug, and get your sense of, how are you looking at that?
Well, I mean, thank you. And it's wonderful to be here, and so wonderful to just be a part of colleagues, but also all the people in the community here. And I'll just say, I mean, to speak very broadly of the question, I'm of course a child who grew up in the heart of the Cold War era and remember the discussions about, I had a mom who worked for the nuclear freeze campaign, and we worried about, nuclear war. And then I became a China scholar. and studied economic development in China. And so we certainly, when I teach classes today, and I have a few students in my classes, and I don't think I'm being dramatic in saying, I think we are at, it's very different than the 1980s, but we are at a moment that at least for doing business in East Asia and thinking about US-China relations, and of course the issue of Taiwan comes into play, but also Xi Jinping's aspirations, brokering deals between Saudi Arabia and Iran in the Middle East, and then meeting Putin, like this feels to me like the most intense moment of global climate and sort of tension. But it also feels very different because as a China scholar, I watch Xi Jinping and I think Xi Jinping's aspiration is for China to retake its position as the most powerful economy, but also the most influential geopolitical actor in the world today. And we need to make no mistake about it. That's his aspiration, and that's what he plans to do. And so how we come to that moment and come to that debate, I loved when the United States was thinking about engagement. We're not in the engagement field anymore. We certainly weren't under the previous president, but when President Biden put Kurt Campbell into position, he said the age of engagement's over. And so I just think we're in an interesting moment of really trying to figure out what the geopolitical stage looks like. And it feels tense to me. It feels very, very significant. So I'll just stop there.
Yes, staying with that topic of US-China as one of the major relationships on the global scale, how do you look at that, Kathleen, in the context of general cooperation, general security, but also scientific cooperation? And how can that actually play into it? Does it even matter what the scientific collaboration there is?
Yeah, so picking up on what sort of Doug was saying, I do think China is a key player right now, and particularly in the work that I do is on security related issues. And you see basically over the past 5 years, there's been so many concerns that have arisen about China exerting sort of its military might, what security implications there are, both for the US and internationally. And so I think we're going to continue to see that in the coming years. And I think a big question is what to make of that. And particularly when we talk about sort of science and technology issues, what do we make of China's enormous investments in science and technology in different spheres? I think where the US is also essentially trying to command leadership. And again, what implications does that have for security threats that the US might face into the future? So I think that is one big area that I think we're going to continue to see develop. And I think it will be interesting to see how, as a nation in the United States, how do we react to that? I think we have seen since, I would say, the last administration, very much on the security side, a lot of fears that have hindered, for example, scientific and technological cooperation with China, in some cases for legitimate reasons, but I think in other cases, I think over exaggerating some of the threats that right now there are. So I think this whole issue of engagement, I think is an interesting and that we can probably talk about more. What would that look like, with China, and how might further engagement in different spaces with China actually open up spheres where we can feel more secure in certain aspects. And I think one of the things, you mentioned before talking about the Cold War, I think one of the things always to keep in mind is we are in a different time right now, and what we're encountering with China is different than, let's say, what we encountered with the Soviet Union. But we also have to remember to not make the same mistakes that we made compared to the Cold War and how we related to the Soviet Union at that time. There are a lot of, for example, misassessments of the Soviet Union's sort of military capabilities. And a lot of it was a lot of misunderstandings about, for example, just how they were crumbling internally economically. And we didn't have a good handle on then how that would affect their power as a state. So I think there's a lot more that needs to be done when we talk now about China, really how to assess how China might pose a threat now or into the future.
Do you think that the Russia-Ukraine conflict makes it more likely that China might become active militarily?
That's a good question. It's clear that China is watching. And they're choosing, as we saw most recently, choosing to engage very visibly with China. on a public stage and show support, or sorry, for Russia on a very public stage and show support for Russia. You know, I would say I still haven't sort of made up my own mind what that means in terms of how China might sort of militarily exert itself, but I think it's something to watch.
Sophal, are the existing multilateral or global institutions, and we talked about some of them, or I hinted about at some of them, are they adequate actually to achieve security, economic stability, and global governance?
Well, and thank you for that, Peter. It's a hard question because when you think about the institutions that were created, and you refer to them in your opening remarks, the Bretton Woods institutions that we know to be the World Bank, the IMF, and the what was then known the General Agreements on Trade and Tariffs, which became the WTO. I think of it as, at least when I was taught at Berkeley, in political economy, that the notion of Bretton Woods, a banner hanging over Bretton Woods saying, "If goods don't cross borders, soldiers will." This is the kind of lesson I think that we need to understand. We came out of the First World War unable to determine who would hand off power. The British Empire was crumbling. The US was rising, but not willing to take on that responsibility. Instead, you get the interwar period and a Second World War before the US finally wakes up and says, I think we need to do something about this and not have another terrible catastrophe economically and in terms of loss of life. Are the current institutions capable? I would say you have a system that was built after World War II, permanent 5 members that have veto power. It's kind of rigged to basically be what was thought to be the world order after World War II, and it continues on to this day. But it's very problematic when one thinks about countries like India, for example, countries that are as large or soon to be larger than China, not having a permanent seat, having to constantly be elected to the Security Council, not being able to veto. These are sort of original sins from the creation of the New World Order that simply can't be fixed within the context of the existing order, right? So you have now China creating the AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Their answer to, well, if we can't deal with the existing order, we're going to create our own institutions. And they've been doing that. It looks, at least on the surface, very much like any other institution, just doesn't have the US or Japan as members of the AIIB. And, China is doing its own version of a kind of Marshall Plan, but based on loans with the Belt and Road Initiative. So $1 trillion there in loans for infrastructure. Recently, CBS News had a video segment on the BRI in Cambodia, for example, a country of my birth. And I was intrigued because one of my friends was interviewed and he was asked, how do you compare the US and China in terms of investor style? And my friend said, oh, China is here, the US isn't here. All that says to me is this is the kind of challenge that in Washington, DC, they say, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And it looks like we're next if we're not at that table, really. We need
quick follow-up and then to Kathleen. So you mentioned rightfully that we're still living with a structure that was formed after World War II and left out a lot of the developments now. So why are we not able to adjust that, but instead we are trying to conceive other ones that have other failures? So maybe Kathleen, you can take that on in addition to what you wanted to add to Sophal's.
Okay, so could you restate that?
So so UN, I'm just reminded of the discussion of the Security Council in roughly around February 24 last year, when the issue came before the Security Council, and it was chaired by Russia, and Russia had a veto right. So it showed how dysfunctional in these kind of circumstances the UN is. So that is recognized. Other mechanisms are contemplated. Are we fast enough, and are we actually imaginative enough to come up with structures that would avoid the same kind of mistakes of leaving out major players?
If you're following up with me, no, I think that the original sin of saying, okay, these 5 countries can veto anything that they'd like because by virtue of how the institution was created means that somebody would have to say, I no longer want to have this position and we need to change this. And we all have to agree to change this. And I think that that's probably too difficult. You have now, I think, Russia chairing once again. Is it the General Assembly? It's once again in a situation where discussions of Russia's crimes are being discussed, and Russia doesn't want to talk about them. There's nothing to see here, right? And it's extremely difficult when the Human Rights Council or whichever human rights body, for example, has to be chaired by a human rights abusing country, for example. It just loses all credibility at that point. But can we move forward in some ways? And why are they creating parallel institutions? It's the same thing as when prime ministers in countries decide that this ministry doesn't work. I'm just going to create a parallel institution that will do exactly what that ministry is supposed to do, but we're just going to call this person senior advisor and make them in charge of the area of that ministry. It happens everywhere. It seems to be what's happening in a global order that can't seem to adapt. So people go off on their own. And hopefully we're not going to have another war to basically reset the order again. But as Mark Twain said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes.
Yep. So Kathleen.
Yeah, I'm just going to jump in and just echo support for what Sophal was saying about, the concerns about, again, China and its Belt and Road Initiative. And we're often so focused, I think, on the Chinese kind of the military threats that we often don't think about the economic issues, which actually could be much more powerful, I think, now and into the future. And I was reminded when Sophal was mentioning about if the US is not at the table, if they're not visible, like the challenges that brings. A few years ago, I was working in the State Department and had an opportunity to go on official travel to a country. And we were meeting, me and my colleagues were meeting with the ambassador of that country. And we were trying to sort of raise some other political issues related to that particular country in question. And that the ambassador basically said back to us, do you see all of the Chinese investments that are happening in this country? They're building roads, they're building airfields. What is the US doing? It's hard for me to come to the table with said country if all we're doing is casticizing, criticizing that country for X, Y, or Z, and we're bringing nothing else to the table. And so it's exactly what Sophal was saying, that I think we need to be thinking more about our economic influence in addition to the military issues. And I think we haven't worked on that as well as in the United States.
Greg, looking at everything we have heard here, not surprisingly, the most recent UN Human Development Report highlights a collective uncertainty on a global scale. So how is fear fueling this uncertainty? And how can trust and collective confidence be built under such dynamic and uncertain current conditions?
Thanks, Peter, and thanks to Vicky and Henry. Fear is a big factor, and so anxieties about what is going to happen to our country drive policies in many countries. I think that's not equally true everywhere. So there's lots of fear, unevenly distributed. There are lots of aspirations. Doug spoke of Xi Jinping's aspirations in China, which are not driven by fear so much as by a sense that it really is possible for China to play a much.
Turn on your mic.
Okay, so there's fear that your mic isn't on, and anxiety, but there's aspiration, right? And I think we need to step back a little bit. Let me put it in terms of the Cold War. The Cold War was relatively orderly. We're in a less orderly moment in some ways right now. The Cold War was an achievement of order that kept falling apart, Korean War, other conflicts, but where it was kind of clear who had to be brought to the table to resolve or stabilize things to a greater degree. The UN and other institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, created, as Paul said, and I'll be stronger even than Sophal said. They're created at a moment of US and Western hegemony to match that US and Western hegemony. It's not just that there happened to be a design flaw, oh, we'll have 5 permanent members. It's that these are the countries that feel they are entitled to be on top of a new world order after the first half of the 20th century brought 2 world wars and the Great Depression and all of that. So there are these agendas. Now, how do we get to both the level of complexity and the possible aspirations of this? Well, there are agendas like development. There are agendas of strong engagement. Let's build global capitalism. Let's make it growth. Let's be proud to be a disruptive industry. Let's disrupt and change. And do we renew consistently through that? So I think even more telling than the Security Council that Sophal referred to is the World Bank, and really much more, and the IMF, and much more a precipitator of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank issue and the BRICS Bank, is that the Western countries aren't willing to give China a role in governance of the global institutions created after World War II, commensurate with its actual economic weight in the world. And China says, well, under these circumstances, instead of playing the game of trying to be in your cooperative regime that you have dominated, you're not going to let us be part of the leadership. We'll change the game. And they have the capacity to change the game. And the Belt and Road Initiative is central standard bearer for this, but there's lots of dimensions to it. Now, back to the question here. So that creates a destabilized situation in which a variety of leaders can ask, what's threatening to our country? What's a possibility for us? What do we have to worry about? But what can we hope for? And it's not just is the US at the table, it's, what is this thing called the West that produced Western hegemony? Does it hold together? Is it coherent? Does it offer us opportunities? Wherever you look at Russia, at China, but also say at Central Asia, you see countries asking, how are we going to fit into this? You see questions about, can we really prosper fully in the terms of the so-called Washington consensus or what's left of it, the mainstream order, or do we need something different in security terms, in economic terms, energy policy, the huge issues of energy in the world today that are going on. So come back to the underlying question, what's different with the Cold War? There are some destabilizing factors that weren't present. Take finance, right? The globalization of finance was not the same kind of issue in 1949 that it is in the current period. And so we have central banks around the world raising interest rates to fight inflation that was itself produced by low interest rates and earlier. So governance is running amok. So people are afraid of a variety of kinds of threats and instabilities. Add in climate change, add in all of the range of others. And so I think it's not at all surprising that we have what we tend to denigrate as new nationalisms. I think we have people say, what's going to happen to us? And how can we organize to make sure that what happens to us isn't so bad? We don't want that disastrous outcome or that disastrous outcome. So this isn't just some ideology that's spread. It's not like communism during the Cold War, communism versus capitalism. That's not the structure. It is not an alignment between nationalism and other powers, not an alignment of this kind. Right? There are state capitalist countries, countries where the state plays a bigger role in capitalism, but they're capitalist, including China in many ways, and others. So I think what we're looking at is the decline of American and Western hegemony without the repair work to adequately reconstruct institutions for more cooperative multilateral sharing of power to stabilize affairs.
So just quickly following on, do you think that the major threat, that's what I heard you say, but I might have misinterpreted that, from China is through the economic power, or do you think there is also a strive towards being militarily a bigger player?
There's no question there's both. It seems to me
Yeah.
that China sees itself being a great power and leading in the world and being able to be constructive as it does this. So I don't think China just sees, oh, we can knock off the US. I think the Chinese aspirations include, we can organize a world order that works better, at least for us, but really for our allies and those who work with us. So the Belt and Road ambition, which has remade infrastructure, remade trade across Asia dramatically, during an era when, as Kathleen suggested, the US was kind of asleep on the job with this, has created new alignments. Now, it's not automatic that China wins and dominates. I mentioned Central Asia. Well, Central Asian countries also have links to the Middle East, to oil producers, to the OPEC countries, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates. They're Islamic countries, as well as oil-rich countries. So there's a north-south axis competing with a more east-west one for this. But what there is a competition for is for being able to bring order, to stabilize things in new terms. And so I think China's military power has grown and will grow and is intimately bound up to the economy, because if you were an officer in the People's Liberation Army 30 years ago or 40 years ago at the time of the War of Vietnam, something you would say, part of our biggest problem is we've got a lot of soldiers and we have no technology. We've got to get technology. That means we've got to develop our economy to be able to produce the technology, to be able to arm our Air Force, to be able to build the Navy that we have, right? And so decades of development of the economy have been partly driven by developing technology for the military, partly driven by getting people out of poverty and building better housing and public services, partly driven by the effort to get rich. And then there gets to be a readjustment in this. And Xi Jinping's era says, okay, we need to tighten the links among these different dimensions of our project. We can't have the PLA going this way and private businessmen going that way and consumers driving this. We're going to pull it together. And that's the tightening of so-called authoritarian control with Xi Jinping. And it's all of the above. And so you can't say it's the risk economic domination or it's the risk military. The risk is failure to adjust the world order to a new balance of power.
Yeah, thanks. So we have actually focused quite a bit on East-West, but we also know that there is a big gradient in North-South relationships and dynamics actually. How does that play into future security or insecurity on a global level? Let's start with you, Doug.
So I'm going to answer the question, but just to come back to a couple of these themes,
Yep.
We need to make no mistake about it. Some of these issues may be symbolic, but the symbolism is very real. I cannot tell you how many conversations I have with Track 2 officials in China who are just still deeply offended by the fact that China gets the children's seat at the table as part of the G20, never been invited to the G7. Now, people in the United States will very quickly say, well, that was for advanced industrialized democracies. Well, that's not true because we let Russia in 2008 and then Crimea happened. But the Chinese people are just like, enough, like, sorry, that doesn't. And then to just track that onto, and this gets to your question, to BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative is very important because it's not just about economic development and about China's giving loans to Pakistan and Kenya. And this is about, and in China, the term is Nannan Hezuo, which means South-South relations. So if you ask people like, what's the logic, and they're just, this is really, it's a very fundamental thing. It's that this is about a pivot away from interdependence and reliance on the US and Europe. Now, of course, Xi Jinping doesn't want to make it look like that. And, 3 of the 5 largest exporters from China to the United States are US companies, including Walmart and Apple. And so clearly the marriage is real, but BRI is about like, you know what? We don't need you guys. Like, we are going to develop our relations in the South China Seas and in Malaysia and Africa. And think, for example, about Africa. So we in the United States have decided Huawei can't be here because Huawei is infected by, red on face ties of the PLA and et cetera, et cetera. Like, that's fine. We'll just build the internet infrastructure and cell phone infrastructure in Africa. We got this. And so I just think like there is a real kind of interesting and intense balancing act here, but I love the question because this is not just about the East and the West. This is about the North and the South, and China is positioning itself to be the leader of the global South. I mean, I think there's no question about that right now.
Can I jump in on this?
Go ahead.
I agree with everything Doug said. It's not just East, West, North, South either. It's a re-regionalization of the world and a restructuring of alliances and partnerships and trade relations and flows around the world. And so it produces a new sense of region in some places, different from our old ideas of just how the world would fit, and new structures of relations. But the South-South theme that Doug raises is really important. It's not just North-South. How does Europe relate to the South? How does the US relate to the South? During the Cold War, there was a non-aligned movement, famous for the Bandung Conference, 1954. And it never really successfully pulled together all the countries that were post-colonial, emerging from colonial power, becoming sovereign independent countries, but it tried, right? And that's unfinished business of an older history that is now on the table, because the post-colonial moment may have been the 1940s and 50s, 60s, but the ability to really take a full sovereign place in world affairs is still an issue for India. India is still chafing on, are we being treated by others, but are we also able to see ourselves in this way? This is part of China's story. We may say, oh, well, China's now a superpower, being denied a variety of representations, but there is still a consciousness of having been subordinated, abused, dominated by imperialists for a long period of time. Africa, 1960 was the year of Africa, all the new independent countries, right? This was going to be a fantastic future. Latin America, and what happened was a very dependent kind of development in Africa, in Latin America, in the Middle East, in most places, which did not work for the kind of aspirations that people in those regions and in those countries had. And so now many of them have new projects of economic development, investment from China, but it's not just China, it's investment in different global order, different relationships.
So let's add another component to the discussion, which I alluded to in my introductory remarks. We have enough instabilities and conflicts, implicit, explicit conflicts of the quote unquote traditional kind. Now we are adding more pressure onto the system by things such as climate change, but also food security, water security. And that leads, and already has shown that it leads to migration that is driven by environmental issues. And in essence, we are looking at an unequal distribution of the outcomes of overconsumption that puts even more pressure on the quote unquote global South. How does that actually factor in as we are looking ahead, let's say, the next few decades? Because that pressure will increase, and it will. We saw how the migration out of Syria rattled Central Europe and Scandinavia and other countries. Kathleen, how are you looking at that?
I can jump in, maybe just some things that came to mind as you were talking. So again, I mostly study security, and a lot of my work is focused on like the U.S. intelligence community and really trying to understand how do they assess, understand emerging threats. And what's clear is that there tends to be this focus on either particular states or particular maybe emerging technology could be another area where you see security focus on. But you don't really see, unfortunately, a lot, I think enough security attention on things, climate change related issues that can affect more natural disasters, migration, and how those can create either local or regional instabilities as well that can actually have a lot of different sort of follow-on effects. So I do think we need to be thinking more. When I look at like the US security community, the intelligence community, we don't really have strong, scholars or experts in those areas that really understand these dynamics and how they can create security problems in addition to the classical ones that people focus on. So I think that is, an important area that needs to be developed more.
So Paul, following on that, just looking at COVID, which is another type of, let's say, environmental threat. Are we ready to deal with these? Did we learn enough from COVID that we actually are better prepared moving forward?
Well, my assessment, my most recent book is Viral Sovereignty and the Political Economy of Pandemics, what explains how countries handle outbreaks. I'm not at all confident. It seems as though we have a view of, 6 million deaths, $16 trillion in losses, and still a kind of reluctance to understand that cooperation is where we prevent these things, right? And investment in basic global health facilities and services, which of course, how did we end up where we are with countries that could go on the tarmac and bid against each other for some personal protective equipment or supplies and so on. And of course, the richest got what they wanted and everybody else was left without anything. What we've learned, I think, is that the fear, I'm afraid, that countries like Indonesia, when the idea of viral sovereignty was created, viral sovereignty is this notion that a virus is the intellectual property of the country in which it's found, which seems very odd because it's not like they invented the virus. It's not like it's a flower or something, but yet the argument is you can't take this viral isolate out and create a vaccine from it because you found it in my country and I demand that you provide some benefits in exchange for this, i.e. vaccines. Don't come back and sell me a vaccine for $500 million. Agree that if I'm going to give you, if I'm going to share these samples, you're going to come back and provide for me the solution to the problem. You quickly understand then that the reason why countries would behave this way is because they don't have the technology. They don't have the means to create the vaccines. China tried to do it, ended up with a couple of vaccines that were not as effective as ours. And frankly, went with their zero COVID policy, which I think made sense for them. But then when they turned it off, it was like an overnight thing. Let's just have a free for all and let everybody go wherever they want, which of course led to a lot of deaths. Yeah, are we ready? I think the warning is always, the concern is always that we haven't yet learned the lessons. Now, of course, there's about 2 to 3 pandemics per century. So we've already had swine flu, H1N1 in 2009, and now we've had COVID in 2019.
Could be speeding up.
Yes, we could be above average, really, on the number of pandemics in this century. And part of it is globalization means you can just hop on a plane and the disease goes from Hong Kong to Vancouver, as happened with SARS. But not just that, you have urbanization and just people living more closely to each other and rural areas rapidly changing. So all of these problems are coming to a head. But I hope we're investing in what is required, what we know to be the necessary measures for preventing the next pandemic from taking the kind of toll we've paid for COVID.
Can I stick a comment in this? I agree with Sophal. We often talk about this as though the learning is going to be scientific and technical, and it's going to work equally for everybody. And I think part of what we learned in this pandemic, and could have learned from a variety of others, is that there is no escaping from politics, economics, and inequality. And pandemics and their outcomes are governed by politics, economics, and inequality in very basic ways. And so there's no one size fits all. We're just doing the good science. Everybody will benefit solution that doesn't have to connect to that.
Actually, you're right on point. That's the whole sort of theme of my book. The idea that Churchill made years ago, scientists on tap, but not on top, meaning scientists could be advising politicians, but it's the elected officials who make the decisions, right? It's how you end up with the cure being worse than the disease, right? This kind of argument that we can't possibly pay the price for this solution that you are advising scientists because it's going to cost too much. It's going to be too painful. But I changed that to technology on tap, but not on top, so that doesn't offend scientists. But technology really is kind of this often seen as a solution to everything. And it's like, you can have the technology, you can have all the technology you want, but if the country doesn't accept it and says this is a bioweapon you're giving us, it's not gonna have the outcome that you hope for. So thank you. Thanks for bringing that up, Craig.
And you know, the excess death toll actually points towards 15 million.
Yes.
And what we see here might actually be a sign to us that the self-regulation of the planet, if we are not more careful with it, will come through that route. It always has in history. So moving towards the end here, let's just take a quick round here with the question, where do you think globalization will go? We see advantages, we also saw disadvantages. What in your view will happen with globalizations if we are looking at the next few years to few decades? And I start here with Doug and then we just go around.
Thank you. And again, great questions and love the discussion. And just to be very brief and very quick, where is globalization going to go? And I think this is actually an unfortunate statement because in the United States, we are fundamentally governed not by smart economic growth or even things like GDP. We are governed by the Dow Jones Industrial Average and profitability of corporations, right? And so when you think about things like where's globalization going to go, and people ask me about what's happening with US-China relations, the fundamental issue, and this comes from work that I've done with a couple of the key players, like we're married to China. There is no second road here. There's just not. And you know, there are complex issues about why Apple is the most profitable company in the world, but it's fundamentally because of its embeddedness in China and its embeddedness in China's brilliant, advanced and technologically advanced manufacturing supply chain. There is no other country in the world, like there's a lot of hand waving about Foxconn building a plant in India and you know, this is happening here. No, this is not, Apple is not going anywhere and it's not. And you know, just, so on the one hand, I wish we had, in terms of the question of globalization, I wish we had more responsible politicians who were thinking about economic engagement, thinking about conversations, thinking about economic and military engagement and sort of thinking about who are the players at the table. But the bottom line is, in my view, is that we are so economically intertwined, at least from the myopic view in the United States, we are not delinking from China. It's just not happening. And so I think leaders need to roll up their sleeves and get to the table and be smart about how they include people like Xi Jinping in conversations about these issues. Because, you know, if you look at the players like Apple and Walmart and all of the other largest companies in the world that are fundamentally tied to China, they're not going anywhere.
Kathleen, how are you looking at that?
So I was actually thinking a little bit, some of what Doug was mentioning, but for me, it just occurred to me what an exciting time it is to think about globalization and to be a student or a scholar in this time where you're going to have all of these complex issues that we need solutions for. And I think one of the great strengths of ASU is the interdisciplinary nature of how studies work here, that there's going to be so many different facets of how do we think about globalization from a security perspective, from an economic perspective, that, I mean, I would be excited to work on those problems as a scholar and hopefully as a student too. I think as Doug mentioned in his last comments, I think it does push this issue that we kind of start out with, this need for how do we think about engagement with actors or entities that we don't like or are concerned about. How do we actually think about constructive engagement with China, with other countries and entities that we're going to have to be dealing with in the future? And to do it in a way where it's a respected kind of dialogue. I think that's the tricky part.
Can I just say before you, Kathleen said that in a much nicer tone than I did. So thank you. You're awesome. I just want to change my tone.
Yeah, sometimes you have different kind of tones to get to the harmony here. Sophal.
Well, on the direction of globalization, I think that what we've seen, and Craig pointed to this early in his earlier comments about how nationalism has become this outgrowth, a kind of double movement reaction to globalization, because people are saying, well, what's going to happen to us? What, when jobs keep moving, offshoring, industries sunset, where is our future? Brexit obviously was one sign that surprised a lot of people. The election of our last president, that's another sign of a desire to question the current trend of things. But I would also say that we've seen globalization before. The rise of empire and the ability to obtain whatever goods you wanted, and within a few hours, it seemed, at least if you lived in London, because even though we think of Apple now as this more than $2 trillion market capitalization company, and might even think that it's the most valuable company that ever existed in the world. In fact, in 1637, the Dutch East India Company was worth $8.28 trillion. So we understand, of course, that globalization will have its ups and downs, and then there'll be these wars that will tell you that people aren't on the same page. When I made my first remarks about how Bretton Woods had this banner that said, if goods don't cross borders, soldiers will. Thunderbird has its informal motto as borders frequented by trade and diplomacy seldom need soldiers. Sort of the same statement, but stated differently. But this idea that essentially, if we don't understand that globalization needs to continue in order to prevent war from happening, then we will face more wars going forward. The lessons of the past, even though they've been learned, will be forgotten, and mistakes will be repeated, unfortunately.
Thanks. Greg?
So I worry that the word globalization makes it harder for us to understand what's going on, because it makes us think that this is a smooth diffusion of the same things going everywhere. So globalization is you can buy cornflakes any place in the world or something like that. And that sort of erases, again, the several things. It erases the elements of power and politics that are always there. There's just never that sort of smooth market-driven globalization without elements of power and politics. There's never just a diffusion without transformation. I mean, just think about the United States and the idea of globalization. This is deindustrialization. This is a huge technological upheaval driven by new and different technologies that transform communications, that transform the nature of business organizations, that produce Apple Computer, as well as many others with roots in the 1970s that go on to become this. So globalization is a transformation, not a spread, and it extends to culture and all of this. So I think we need to ask about what are the kinds of transformations, which could include some decentralizations, but are likely to include very large-scale systems still. We are, as Doug put it, just inextricably committed to a lot of this. So it would be hugely wrenching to reverse it, but we can change the terms of it. And that's what a lot of nationalisms around the world are trying to do. They're not trying to completely deglobalize and pull back and be independent, sort of Albania 50 years ago or something like that. They are trying to change the terms of their relationships to flows of trade. And to say the supply chain issues that we've seen come forward. There's a long history of this. Now, I won't belabor all of that, but let me say the single biggest thing that's happened, I think, in this, or one of the biggest things, that is a question going forward, raised by Doug's point about Apple, is that many of the most powerful global actors trying to do global governance are business corporations rather than countries or alliances of countries. And we haven't yet woken up to that and figured out how to integrate business corporations into our thinking about global governance effectively. All of what we have as the examples, the United Nations, the IMF, the World Bank, indeed the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, are all structured as though the units must be nations. Then we ask, why are people nationalist, right? When lots of the material action is controlled by private capital in corporations. And we had, I think, can expect an era in which doing better at integrating the business with the political in this is in the forefront. And that includes for climate change, for pandemics, for all the issues of planetary health that we focus on in this building.
Thank you. That actually brings us to the end of this conversation. It just flew by, but that typically happens when, you know, it's an interesting topic and we have great contributions. So let me thank Doug, Kathleen, Sophal, and Greg again for a wonderful conversation. And we will have similar ones as we are going through the semesters in the coming year. So thanks everybody.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you.